When I first walked into Royce Innovations, the air itself felt charged, like the hum of electricity before a storm. The lobby gleamed in polished marble and muted light, the kind of space designed to make people feel small. I straightened my tie, clutching the folder that held my contract, and reminded myself that I had earned this job. Months of applications, interviews, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. I was finally going to work for him, Daniel Royce, the man I'd studied in business school, the name behind every headline about innovation and ambition. Daniel Royce wasn't just a CEO. He was a symbol. Sharp, composed, untouchable. The kind of man who made boardrooms fall silent when he entered. I had admired him long before I ever expected to meet him. But admiration, I would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing when it turns into something else. His assistant met me at the elevator and guided me to the top floor. He prefers direct introductions, she whispered, pressing a finger to her lips. The elevator doors opened into a private office large enough to be mistaken for a gallery, sleek furniture, abstract art, walls of glass framing the London skyline. And there he was. Daniel stood by the window, his reflection stretching against the glass. When he turned, I noticed how effortlessly composed he was, as though every gesture had been measured in advance. His eyes, a cool gray, studied me without blinking. "Ethan Miller," he said, his voice low, even, and disarmingly calm. "You're punctual. I appreciate that." "Thank you, sir," I managed, forcing steadiness into my voice. That he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. Let's talk." The conversation started formally enough: work history, professional goals, confidentiality agreements. But then his questions shifted, gently, almost imperceptibly. "Do you live alone, Ethan?" he asked, scanning my resume without looking at me. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Do you enjoy solitude?" I hesitated. "I suppose I've learned to." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Good. It teaches focus." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You'll find this position requires trust. Not everyone can handle proximity." "Proximity?" His gaze lifted to meet mine. "To power. To me." For a moment, the air between us thickened. I couldn't tell if it was intimidation or curiosity that held me still. He dismissed me soon after, but as I left, I caught my reflection in the glass wall, my own expression uncertain, conflicted. The next few days moved with mechanical precision. I learned Daniel's habits, his routines, his impossible standards. He didn't tolerate mistakes, but he didn't raise his voice either. His disappointment was sharper than anger, quiet, deliberate, the kind that lingered. Yet between the rigidity of schedules and deadlines, there were glimpses of something human. Late one evening, I stayed behind to organize his files. The city outside pulsed with rain and traffic. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his voice softened by fatigue. "You work late," he said. "I like to finish what I start." He stepped closer, his tone shifting from observation to something personal. "That's rare. Most people do just enough." I looked up, trying to read him, but his face was unreadable, somewhere between admiration and warning. That he moved toward the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Do you ever feel," he said quietly, "that life becomes too measured? That every choice has to be calculated?" "I think that's the price of success," I replied. "Perhaps." His voice thinned into a whisper. "Or perhaps it's the cost of pretending." The room fell silent except for the faint sound of rain. In that silence, something shifted. I felt it, the awareness, the pull. He turned, his gaze finding mine again. There was no reason for him to hold it that long, yet he did. When he finally spoke, it was softer than before. "I trust you'll learn quickly, Ethan. But remember, some lessons aren't written in manuals." He left the office, and I was alone again. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to the tremor running through me. I didn't understand it then, not fully, but that night marked the beginning of something neither of us could later define as business. As I packed my bag, I glanced once more at the glass where his reflection had been. The skyline blurred behind raindrops, the city lights bleeding into one another like secrets refusing to stay hidden. That I told myself it was admiration, that's all it was, but somewhere, deep down, I already knew better. Daniel Royce was a man of boundaries, until he wasn't. After that night in the rain-lit office, something unspoken began to evolve between us. Our conversations grew longer, the silences heavier. What started as professional precision began to feel personal, almost intimate. Daniel's requests shifted subtly, less about business, more about presence. He'd call me to his office for things he could have easily delegated. "I work better when you're nearby," he once said without looking up from his screen. His words were casual, but the tone carried weight. I told myself it was mentorship, that he simply valued my diligence. Yet, even then, I knew I was rationalizing a current I didn't have the strength to resist. Our late nights became routine. He'd pour 2 glasses of wine after meetings, discussing not profits or projections, but memories, his university days, travels, regrets. He rarely mentioned his wife, Clara, and when he did, it was with the careful neutrality of someone describing a contract, not a relationship. I listened, not out of curiosity but because every word he shared felt like permission to step closer. One evening, after an exhausting week, Daniel invited me to his penthouse under the pretext of reviewing proposals. I arrived expecting a conference table and paperwork, but the room was dim, a jazz record playing softly in the background. The city stretched beneath us, endless and glittering. He handed me a drink and nodded toward the balcony. "You should see the view from here. It helps me think." I joined him, the wind carrying the scent of rain. Below, the Thames shimmered under the streetlights. "You've adapted quickly," he said after a moment. "Most people need months to understand how I operate." "I pay attention," I replied. He glanced sideways, the faintest smirk touching his lips. "Yes, I've noticed." There was a pause, long enough to blur the line between conversation and confession. When I turned to look at him, his gaze met mine, steady, unreadable. "You remind me," he said softly, "of who I used to be." Something inside me folded then. Admiration became something darker, needier. I couldn't look away. He took a slow breath, as if weighing the consequence of the next moment, then stepped closer. His voice was almost a whisper. "Ethan, do you know why I hired you?" I shook my head. He reached out, his fingers grazing my wrist, lingering. "Because you see me. Not the name, not the title. Me." The words landed somewhere between confession and temptation. I didn't move, couldn't. The silence stretched until it felt fragile enough to break. Then, he withdrew his hand, eyes softening with something that looked like regret. "I shouldn't have said that," he murmured, retreating into the apartment, but it was already too late. After that night, nothing felt the same. Our interactions carried an invisible tension, each glance longer, each word slower. When his hand brushed mine as he handed me a file, I felt it for hours afterward. He never mentioned the balcony again, yet I could feel that moment echoing in every conversation. Weeks blurred into a rhythm of proximity and denial. He'd call me into his office late in the evening, ostensibly to discuss strategy, but neither of us seemed to care about numbers anymore. Once, he caught me staring at him mid-sentence. Instead of looking away, he asked quietly, "What are you thinking?" I lied. "Nothing, sir." He nodded, but the ghost of a smile betrayed him. "That's never true." The night it finally happened was unplanned. We'd just returned from a corporate event, both a little drunk, both tired of pretending. In the dim back seat of the car, our hands brushed. Neither of us pulled away. When the driver dropped us off, Daniel told him to leave. The air between us was sharp with anticipation. He opened the door, his expression unreadable. "Come upstairs," he said simply. I followed. Inside, the silence was deafening. He poured wine again but didn't hand me a glass. Instead, he looked at me as though searching for permission neither of us could give. Then, without warning, he closed the distance. The kiss was hesitant, testing, like a man touching fire for the first time in years. When he finally pulled back, his voice was hoarse. "You should go. I didn't move. He looked away, almost ashamed. Please, Ethan. So I left, heart pounding, head spinning, body trembling with confusion. Outside, the night air hit like a confession. I knew I should feel guilty, but all I felt was alive. The next morning, in the office, Daniel greeted me as though nothing had happened. His tone was clipped, distant. He spoke only of reports and deadlines, his eyes never quite meeting mine. That was when I realized what I had become, something secret, something dangerous, and yet, even as I watched him disappear into his glass-walled office, I knew I would follow wherever this path led, because some fires, once lit, are meant to burn. The morning after blurred into ordinary motions, yet nothing felt ordinary to Ethan. He moved through the cabin with deliberate calm, helping Ryan clear dishes, laughing at stories that rolled too easily from his friend's tongue. But beneath every word, beneath every breath, a secret pulsed between him and Mark, silent and undeniable. Mark behaved as though nothing had happened. His voice carried the same measured tone, his posture as steady as ever. He asked Ryan about his classes, about the next football practice, about things that belonged in the safe rhythm of father and son. To Ethan, however, every glance felt heavy, every word a reminder of the night they had crossed a line. When Ryan left to fetch more firewood, the silence between Ethan and Mark returned, unspoken yet thick. Mark busied himself with the coffee pot, pouring dark liquid into 2 mugs. He slid one toward Ethan without a word. Their fingers did not touch this time, but the absence of contact made the memory of it sharper. Ethan stared into the swirling steam, forcing his voice steady. Do you regret it? Mark's hand stilled on the counter. He did not look up immediately. When he finally did, his eyes were cautious, weighed down by something Ethan couldn't read fully. I don't regret feeling it, he said at last. But I regret what it means. Ethan swallowed. The words cut more deeply than silence would have. Because of Ryan. Because of everything, Mark corrected, his jaw tightening. This isn't a road either of us can walk without consequence. The conversation ended as Ryan returned, arms full of wood, breaking the fragile honesty. Ethan forced a smile, but his stomach coiled tight. He told himself he could bear it, that the memory of one night would fade with distance. Yet every shared glance across the room told him otherwise. The day unfolded in fragments. They hiked along the wet shoreline once the rain eased, Ryan bounding ahead with the energy of someone oblivious to shadows. Mark trailed behind, steady and quiet, and Ethan found himself caught in the middle, torn between loyalty and longing. At one point, Ryan climbed a fallen log, balancing precariously as he shouted some challenge back to Ethan. Ethan laughed, but his eyes shifted instinctively toward Mark, who watched his son with a fondness softened by fatigue. Their gazes met for only a second before Mark looked away, but in that instant Ethan felt the gravity of what they shared, something unspeakable, something that would not vanish. That night, the cabin was quieter. Ryan stayed up late on his phone, stretched out on his bed upstairs. Ethan sat alone in the living room, staring at the dim firelight, waiting without admitting to himself what he was waiting for. Mark appeared at the doorway, his presence filling the room even before he spoke. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You should try to sleep, Mark said. I can't, Ethan admitted. For a long moment, neither moved. The unspoken promise of the previous night hung between them, dangerous and magnetic. Mark finally stepped closer, lowering his voice. This can't become a habit. You know that. Ethan nodded, though the ache in his chest deepened. But you still came. Mark's silence was answer enough. He sat across from Ethan, the distance deliberate this time. His eyes lingered, but his hand stayed firmly in his lap. I need you to understand, he said, his voice carrying both sternness and softness. What happened, it can't define you. Or me. It was a moment, not a path. Ethan nodded again, though the words only tangled further in his mind. He wanted to believe him, yet every glance, every pause, every heartbeat told him the storm wasn't over, it had only changed form. When Ryan's footsteps creaked above, both men fell silent. The moment dissolved into stillness, leaving only the fire to fill the space. Mark rose first, retreating toward the hall without another word. Ethan sat alone, the embers glowing faintly, his thoughts louder than the crackle of wood. He knew the weekend would end, the cabin would empty, and life would resume. But something had been carved into him, into them both, and though he didn't know where it would lead, he knew this wasn't an ending. It was only the beginning of a silence they would carry, one secret, two hearts, and a storm that refused to pass. "6 months had passed since I walked out of Daniel Royce's office for the last time. The city had changed with the seasons, spring turned to summer, then to autumn, but inside me, time seemed to move slower, as though I was waiting for something I no longer believed would come. That I had found work at a mid-sized consulting firm, a place where ambition still felt pure and uncorrupted. My days were quiet, predictable. I blended in easily among the hum of keyboards and muted phone calls. No one there knew about Daniel or the months that had redefined everything I thought I understood about love, loyalty, and power, but some ghosts don't fade with distance, they follow quietly, reshaping the way you see the world. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of his name in an article or on a news ticker, Royce Innovations launches new initiative, and my chest would tighten before I forced myself to look away. I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that what had happened was a closed chapter. Still, the memory lived like a pulse under my skin, steady and undeniable. One evening, as I left the office, a familiar car was waiting at the curb. I froze. The driver stepped out first, and before I could ask, Daniel emerged from the back seat. That he looked almost the same, immaculately dressed, composed, but there was something different in his eyes, a weariness I hadn't seen before. "Ethan," he said quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding." The sound of his voice brought back everything I'd tried to bury. "What are you doing here?" I asked, struggling to keep my tone steady. That he glanced at the ground, then back at me. "I was nearby. I thought, maybe we could talk." I hesitated. Logic screamed no, but emotion had its own gravity. After a long silence, I nodded. 5 minutes. We walked to a cafe down the street, the kind of place that smelled of roasted coffee and quiet conversations. We sat by the window, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been a man of control. Now, he looked like someone searching for something he'd already lost. "How have you been?" he finally asked. "I'm fine," I said. "Working. Living." He nodded slowly. "I read your name in a report last week. You're doing well." I forced a faint smile. "I learn from the best." He looked down at his cup, then said, almost to himself, "Clara left. She moved to New York 2 months ago." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt pity, part of me resentment, and a smaller, crueler part of me felt vindicated. That he continued, his voice quiet. "I thought it would fix things, that distance would make it easier to forget. But it doesn't. You can't build peace on silence." "Daniel," I said softly, "what do you want from me?" He looked at me then, really looked, no pretense, no power. Just the man beneath the title. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe just to see you. To know that I didn't ruin you." "You didn't ruin me," I said. "You changed me. There's a difference." He nodded, his expression unreadable. The silence between us filled again, but this time it was gentler. For the first time, I saw him not as the man I'd once worshipped but as someone deeply, painfully human. When we finished our coffee, he stood. "I won't bother you again," he said. "You deserve to move forward. You always did." He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. "For you," he added. "No conditions." I watched him leave without opening it. The sound of the cafe door closing felt final. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, people rushing, lights flickering, stories beginning and ending all around me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the envelope. When I finally tore it open, I found a single photograph, the skyline from his penthouse balcony, the night the storm trapped us inside. On the back, in his careful handwriting, were 4 words: "Thank you for seeing me." I folded the photo and tucked it into my wallet beside the note he'd sent months before. Together, they were fragments of something real, something that didn't fit neatly into right or wrong. As I stepped into the night, I realized I no longer waited for him, nor resented what we had. It had become a memory that neither haunted nor comforted me, just a quiet truth I carried: love had come, burned, and left its mark, and sometimes, that was enough.